north of us to Limit where my grandmother lived, and she was the midwife that I was born in the house.
With your grandmother's assistance?
My grandmother delivered me, yes.
Oh, how cool. What was your grandmother's name?
Luella Early.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about your ancestors. You sort of started. Where were they from? Were they from out of country? What do you know about your ancestors?
Well, from my maternal side, they were from Iowa. The history of they have ancestry was English and Irish, and they have traced ancestors back to the colonial days in Virginia. As a matter of fact, there was a relative of General Early, was a relative. You know, he never married and didn't have any children, so there was no direct descendants, but it was part of the family. And my dad's family were from the Netherlands. My grandfather immigrated here in the late 1800s and settled in Plainfield Township. And my dad was born in Kalamazoo. My grandfather had a farm here in Plainfield Township, and then he and his brother went into the produce business in Kalamazoo. And then the rest of my dad's siblings were all born in Kalamazoo. They later came back to Michigan and resettled again in Plainfield Township. So
why did they come back?
My uncle Harry, which was the oldest one of the family, was born in 1901 with an address of Austerlitz, which was a post office for the old Plainfield village. And so they had somewhere around that area, that's where they had the first farm.
Why did they come back from Kalamazoo back to Plainfield? Why did they do that?
Well, my grandfather had a sister that immigrated here earlier. In fact, in the late 1800s, he came to Michigan and stayed with his sister, Anna, married a Scot. And they had a farm over on Grand River Drive towards Lowell. And then he went back to the Netherlands, married, and then immigrated permanently here.
Oh.
So he had relatives here in the township. So.
Okay, all right. So tell me a little bit about your upbringing. What did your parents tell you about why your family had immigrated to Michigan? Why did they want to come here? What did it mean to them to come to Michigan?
Well, going back to my mother's family, they were actually moving to, she was born in the Chicago area, as they were moving from Iowa to Grand Rapids area, because he was going to go to work in the gypsum mines. Hmm. So he was actually coming to Michigan for work.
And what about, well, and your other side was that there were already family members here, that's why? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so when you were growing up, what did your parents talk to you about? About the importance of being an American or being a good citizen?
Well, I guess, first of all, the years that I remember mostly was the early part of World War II. Mm. And so at that period of time I had scrapbooks with different airplanes, tanks, and all the types of things that they had during the propaganda days of supporting the war effort. And so I grew up in an environment then that was coming off the Depression, starting World War II, and of course there was no TV back then, and of course it was just all about radio and printed matter. And so early memories are focused basically on World War II and the reasons why we were in a war, and then the activities and all the other things that they were advertising and and various magazines, Look and Life and so forth, information. So that was probably most of, as far as the environment or what's going on in the country, was focused around that world. There was still a lot of people that were looking for work because of the Depression. In fact, my dad worked for a while on WPA because he couldn't get a job when I was very young. I was the oldest of 5. And so our upbringing was very rural. We always, fortunately, being on a farm, we always had food. We always had a large garden, and we had a root cellar and stored. My mother canned a lot, so we never were without food, but we were what would be considered rural poor nowadays because we had so little. I didn't know what a basketball was until I went from the 6th grade in Belmont school to Comstock Park in the 7th grade. Because all we had was a baseball and a bat and a soccer ball. We made our own rules. So when we got down to Comstock Park, that was kind of an eye-opener because I'd never seen a basketball before. So that was a little different than education, you know.
For sure. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about your parents. What do you remember about them? What were they like as people?
Well, I guess I've taken them individually. My mother was, neither one of my parents went beyond the 8th grade, okay? That was the time that they got out of school and you started working. But my mother was extremely intelligent and she was a quick learner, and people were amazed over the years that she was not a college graduate because of educating herself. And she probably was most influence on us in our education and what we should and shouldn't do more than my dad, because he worked in the factory during the day, worked on the farm at night, and so he was going, working all the time. And so he didn't spend as much time with those types of things. I mean, we helped him on the farm. We had all had our own tasks to do and so forth, but he didn't have as much influence on us and our growth in education as my mother did.
What was your mother's name?
Her name was Lillian Ruth, but she hated the name Lillian, so she always went by Ruth.
Let's see. Okay, and what about your dad?
Well, of course, his Dutch name was Rainier Jacobus, but he went by Ray, and middle name James. It was very typical with my Uncle Harry was actually Heinrika. My aunt was Marika. So these were Dutch names, but they Americanized them.
What factory did your dad work in?
Was in one of the furniture factories, and I'm not sure which one it was. There were several of them at the Grand Rapids at that time, because at that time Grand Rapids was still the furniture capital of the world. So, Berkey and Gay and so many of the other ones, large ones.
Do you remember what he did for the WPA?
Do you remember what?
Do you remember what work he did for the WPA?
Mostly road work. I know that we used to go up and picnic at a lake called Long Lake up near Sparta, and we went up there because he was familiar with it, because one of the projects they had in WPA was developing parks, and he worked on it. So we'd go up there, and it was pretty remote. Now it's really grown, and much the camping ground or the picnic grounds is much larger than it was then. But it was sort of, from where we lived, it was kind of remote. Nowadays, transportation being different, it's easy to get to, but not then.
So when you were growing up, were you living in the farm where you had been born?
Oh yeah. I was born in Mifflin when I was about 6 months old. We moved over on Rogue River Road, and the back end of my grandfather's farm was headquarters in Belmont, right next to the hotel, was the farmhouse, and the back end of his property bordered where I grew up, and so it was like one big farm with two households, and like I said earlier, we all had our tasks to do, and that would be, like in the summer with a hoe out and cutting down milkweeds in a cornfield type thing, obviously. But I learned very early how to drive a team of horses because we were still, when I was very young, we were still working with horses rather than tractors. And the interesting part of that, and I'm not sure my age at the time, because I was probably maybe 8 or 10 years old when they got the first tractor. And then I drove tractor way before we were of age. And then we went back to horses again, because I remember I was driving the team for haying, and one of the guys who used to help us with the haying said, you used to be a pretty good teamster. What happened, because at that period of time I was driving the tractor. Boy, you hurt my feelings, because I thought I was still a pretty good teamster. But I was young enough and small enough that I could drive a team with a wagon or dragging, but not for cultivating or plowing. So I wasn't big enough to physically handle it. So, but yeah, our days were spent outside during the summer, if not working, playing anyway.
So, you did have siblings? You had a brother and a sister?
I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. 4 of us were born within 5 years, and then to my 2 sisters and my second brother. And then the last one came 5 years later, so it was 4 of us within 5-year period, so we were pretty close, and remained close over the years. I was always taught to take care of my sisters. That was my responsibility. That was beat into me by my dad all the time. You take care of your sisters. In later years, my older sister, one next to me, accused me of being overprotective and kept her from having dates in high school.
Is that true?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
So, what are some favorite memories that you have of your family?
Well, we had a lot of get-togethers with my family. Of course, my dad's side, I only had one cousin. But on my mother's side, I had a bunch of them. In fact, her sister, Maxine, I think 11 kids. And the oldest one was about 6 months younger than I was, and I knew him very well. But we had a lot of family get-togethers at holidays at my grandmother's house. And my grandfather died in his late 40s, I believe it was, of leukemia. So she was a widow, but she always had the family gathered around. And most of them lived within, let's see, my Aunt Doris lived in Grand Rapids for a while, but most of them lived within Kent County anyway. So we've had a lot of time doing that. And then on my dad's side of the family, we still got together. I have a lot of pictures of holidays with my cousin, who was 9 years older than me, and my Uncle Harry's family. So we had a lot of get-togethers.
So do you remember your parents having any sense of humor, or were there family jokes that were really precious to you?
Well, I can't think of anything offhand, anything particular. As we talk, I may come up with something. But.
Okay. All right. So, let's see. What about your siblings? Do you have a favorite memory of some secret your family or your brothers and sisters had away from your parents, or anything that you did that was slightly illegal?
Well, yeah, there were several, I guess. The one of them that comes to mind is my brother Dan. I decided he's going to run away from home, And so he's going to get my mother going. I'm going to run away. She says, it's okay, but don't cross the railroad tracks. The railroad got through a 120-acre piece there. So she didn't even bat an eye. You know, she knew what he was up to, and that ended that little episode of his going to run away from home. We had, you know, it was interesting. When we grew up, we were fortunate, even though that from a financial standpoint we were not very well off, but we were fortunate that we had a lot of acreage that was our playground. And most of my childhood, I remember spending so much time in the woods or in the swamps, you know, catching frogs. And we made our own slingshots, we made our own bow and arrows. I loved to camp. If I had any money I made, I had a little paper route. Any money I had was usually purchasing camping equipment, you know, hatchet and a knife and a, you know, backpack and that type of thing. And so we had a huge playground. And as a family, and there weren't children around us to play with. My best friend lived on West River Road through the fields, was probably a mile, and you know, and there was neighbors down the road a ways, and there was one gal of my sister's age, but there weren't a lot of kids to play with, so we played with our, you know, individually. During the winter months, I can remember we set up and we'd play store. Take the table leaves and put them into 2 chairs and take cans out of the cupboard and so forth and pretend we're, you know, the store or we were a schoolhouse or something. And so with the 4 of us being close together, there was a lot of that. My mother was also very handy in making things like, you know, for Christmas, for example, Second World War and all that went on, I had a lot of these toy soldiers, and she would make me mess tents and so forth, mark them up, you know, for military, and so to complete my battleground, for example, on the floor, and so she was real good with that, and with the girls making things too. She was very handy. So those are the, you know, kind of memories I had growing up, which are very pleasant ones, because we would have a lot of time. Like I said, we had our tasks and they had to get done, but in the meantime, we had a lot of free time and there was no outside influences at all. There was one was across the street from me, and there was a triangular-shaped piece of property that belonged to the farm down the road, and it was not fenced in, and they had 3 or 4 cows, and so the 2 youngest ones of the family, they were a Polish family. One was my age, Mary Jane, and then the one, her brother Tony, a little bit older, a couple of years older than us. Anyway, he'd bring the cows down that pasture, but he had to stay there because it was not fenced in. But he had crossed the road to down where he played, and there was a little bit of a grade from the house, from the road down to the house, because it was set back from the property. And he was bigger than me, and we used to fight. And I would get on the high end because I was shorter than he was, being smaller, and he on the low end, so we were more even. So we were swinging each other until we ended up in the wrong position. We have to stop or fight and get back to position, start swinging each other again. So.
Oh, that is classic.
It's too bad they didn't have a camera in those days. But,
how old were you then?
How old what?
How old were you?
At that time? Oh gosh, probably 11 or 12 years old.
Oh my gosh.
Pretty old.
Okay. Now you've mentioned the tasks that you were assigned. So tell me a little bit about those. What did you actually have to get done before you could play?
Well, of course, it depends on the time of the year. I had certain things to do in like feeding chickens, for example. Also, now my dad would get up in the morning and milk the cow. We always had a couple of cows. We always had fresh milk and butter and so forth. So we always had a couple of cows. And Dad would milk them in the morning before he went to work. And then oftentimes I would milk him at night. Many times it would be after dark by the time I'd get out there and milk. And that's another feeling that you have, and I still remember it, is a very cozy feeling. If you haven't grown up on a farm, you can't associate it with it, but if you went into the milking parlor where the cows were actually stationed, it was very warm, because even though there was no heat but the body heat from the animals, so you walk in, it's a very pleasant feeling, and a very comforting one, coming out of a cold, and then go to the warm barn. And so I'd milk oftentimes at night. The most I did at one time, I was in high school. At that time my uncle hurt his back, and he couldn't milk. He was, I think, milking 8 cows at the time. And I would get up in the morning for a couple of weeks, milk these cows, and I didn't mind it because I was able to drive his car to school, otherwise I had to take the school bus. So I didn't mind getting up very early and hand milking cows. Yeah. So,
when did you learn to drive?
When I learned to drive, when I was about 8 years old, I think. We had, first, we had an old doodle bug, and that's just basically a truck cab that's been torn apart, and it was the rear tires were actually bolted on type thing. But then it wasn't, when my uncle got the Ford tractor, I did a lot of driving then, and I'm guessing probably 11 or 12 years old at that time. And I know that before I was 16, I was hired by some folks that had a farm up near Sparta, and they'd milked quite a few cows. And they were going to some kind of convention. Anyway, they hired me to come and milk the cows while they were gone. And so I took a friend of mine up, and they left us all kinds of food. And of course they had milking machines, because they were milking, I don't remember now, maybe 25 head or something. And so we'd get up early in the morning and milk the cows, and get it ready for the milk truck to come pick it up. We didn't have breakfast, but they left us a car. And neither one of us had driver's license yet, because we weren't old enough. But we used to take the car over to the lake and spend the afternoon at the lake, get back in time to milk at night. And they left us a freezer full of food. And they commented afterwards, said, all the meat was gone, but the no vegetables were all there. And I thought, that's strange.
But not really.
So.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about the neighbors or the friends that you had when you were growing up.
Well, down across the street and down, of course, it was Mary Jane Golick, and we played together a lot when we were real small. And then the next one, of course, the guy that I really spent most of my years as a friend, fell through high school, lived on Westover Road, and that was about a mile through the field to get to his house. And
what was his name?
Joe Ripley. And on west of us, there was one girl about my sister's age from the old King Davis farmhouse there. And but that was it. There wasn't anybody close by.
So as far as games, what were you doing? Were you swimming, or what?
For games?
What did you do? Yeah, with your friends.
Well, when I got old enough so that was getting fouled and stuff, we played a lot of softball. When I was enough to be off on my own, basically, or be able to go to Belmont and play. And we played a lot of softball. Most of the outdoor activities, though, was basically what we did ourselves, with making slingshots and target practicing that with. We'd go frog hunting with our bows and arrows, and we did a lot of fishing. Joe lived on West River Road, so very close to Grand River, and we'd go down there and fish, but then we'd also did in Rogue River and ride our bikes. Now, the first bike I had, I bought from my Uncle Bud, my mother's brother, for like $3, but it didn't have any fenders and nothing. It was just a plain old bike, and so every penny I got fenders for it. But we used to ride down like the Plainfield Bridge and catch pike underneath the bridge there, and a couple places on Rogue River that we would could walk to and spend the afternoon fishing. So we did a lot of that. That's another thing my dad did a lot, spend time with when he worked very hard, but he did take time to take us fishing, and we'd go sometimes just locally in Grand River, but occasionally we'd go up north some places, some lake. As we talk, there's different thoughts come to my mind. One of them is that, to give you an idea how we were kind of isolated in a way, but I remember one time I had a penny, and my sister and I walked up along the tracks to Belmont to Dan Court's store, he had a grocery store, and I thought for that penny I could get one package of gum, and so I had the penny, and so and unwrapped its package, took out his one stick and gave it to me, and then of course I cut it in half, shared it with my sister. But we didn't, I didn't have any idea, because we didn't have any extra money to spend, what you could buy with that. I just had to assume it was one penny. But I have often thought, I said, that guy had to be a great guy. Here's this kid in there with one penny. So he opens up a pack of gum and gives me one stick. I thought, who else would do that? So I thought, I think that very often with Dan Court. Yeah, he had that grocery store for years. He was also the postmaster. So.
That's a great story. Okay, so tell me a little bit about where you went to school.
Okay, I started in Belmont School. That was basically the new school at the time. It was a two-room, basically built as a two-classroom. But when I was going there, they had opened up the basement, which had like a mini auditorium. And so there was a kindergarten, first and second grade in that room, and then third, fourth, and fifth, and one in the upstairs room, then sixth, seventh, and eighth. But when I left the sixth grade to go to the seventh grade, when we started that fall, there was not enough room. And so at the last minute, what they decided to do, Comstock Park got a bus, and they started busing then the seventh and eighth graders from Belmont to Comstock Park. And that was a big change for us, because it was like, when we made that change, there was only 8 kids in my class. And so, give you an idea of the size there. And so going from Belmont School, where, very close, very few people, to, at that time, my gosh, this great big school. But there was one, Floyd Rector, he grew up in Belmont. I knew him from Belmont days, but his folks had moved to Comstock Park prior to that time. So we, of course, when we were transported to Comstock Park, then Floyd kind of helped us find our way around the school building. But that was, that was quite a traumatic experience to go from that little two-room school and to Comstock Park. But so I went through the seventh grade through 12th grade to Comstock Park.
Were there instances there where you were bullied or made fun of? Was that part of your discomfort there?
You mean in Comstock Park? Mm-hmm. Well, no, we were kind of looked at as being rural rubes, because we did come from the country. But not so much, because, Comstock Park was not an elite area either, so no, it was just a matter of getting acquainted. And like I said, we were, from a standpoint of sports, for example, we didn't have the organized sports that they did. That's why I said I didn't even know what a basketball was till I went to Comstock Park. And same thing with, I don't think we had a football either, but basically had, softball, bat, and soccer ball. And so there was an education that we had to go through. And of course we get made fun of because we didn't know some of these things, but it didn't take long to assemble it because, the guys that I ran with, we very quickly caught up with them as far as sports were concerned. And in fact, a couple of friends, and one of them I still meet with once periodically, but one of the guys that he and I have been buddies for, he had passed away here not too long ago, but he and I were friends from the 7th grade on. And no, that mix wasn't a problem at all.
Oh, good. So let's talk about the changes in Plainfield Township. From your childhood, because I get that there was already a change in the school, but what other kinds of changes did you notice?
Well, of course, a big change, it went from a rural farm community. Just after the Second World War, many of the farmers got together and formed a co-op, and they bought the hotel in that area, that ballroom and so forth, from Jake Hardy, and formed this co-op, and this is where we got our feed. Now we got our coal, go from the coal yards there and so forth. So it went from a farm community, and it was kind of it kind of hit me kind of hard because I left the state and lived outside of Michigan for a number of years. When I came back, I couldn't believe that out of my hunting grounds and places where I stomped were all housing developments. And it become more of a suburb of Grand Rapids all of a sudden from being more of an isolated farm. And things happen. A good example of this is like I mentioned earlier, we had growing up at our house, we had a couple of cows. And after I had left home, I went to service and got married, so my dad had to sell the cows because kids were in the pasture playing, and some kid broke his leg, and instead the cow kicked him. Well, these are all milk cows out in the pasture, and not going to kick anybody. But nevertheless, it cost him. So he said, enough's enough, and sold the cow. Of course, our kids were, my siblings were all gone by that time, so he sold the cows. But it just showed the difference that we had very few kids to play with when I grew up, but then all these developments, and they had kids running all over. In fact, at one point on the back pasture, some kids made a golf course. They had dug holes in there, and my mother would have a fit about it, but there's nothing you can do, And so that was a major change to me, was to see that from the rural community to a lot of land that's no longer being tilled, and housing developments going in. I mean, where I grew up is a house development, that whole area there. So that was the biggest change that I saw. Another change I saw, which was really upsetting to me, is what happened to Rogue River. We had a swimming, where the current bridge is right now, we had a little swimming hole there. And the water was cold, pure, clean water, but it was condemned because of the toxic chemicals that were coming from the Wolverine as well as the Rockford paper mills. In fact, the whole bottom of the river just turned with green algae and nasty looking. And that was a big disappointment, but later years I come back and I walk some of our old haunt down through the railroad tracks down to Rogue River. And well, the river was clean because they had by that time cleaned it up and disposed of their toxic chemicals in other ways. And it was cleaned again. But that was a change which was a little hard to take too when you're used to growing up with not having any concerns about that type of unseen chemicals that affecting your health. So
let me make sure I heard you correctly. You said farmers formed a co-op and they bought a hotel?
Yeah, the hotel in there is what still exists.
Which one was it?
Okay.
What hotel is there in Belmont?
well, it's a house now, basically, because the ballroom was taken off, was removed here, I think in the 60s. That was originally built as a hotel by Isaac Post. And Jake Hardick owned it, and it was on about a 2.5 acre piece, the triangular shaped piece, part of the old Whitney farm, when he built that hotel. And when I was growing up, the ballroom was on. In fact, this is another little thing that is worth talking about, is that Saturday night they would have a box social, and the women would prepare a dinner for two and put it in a box and all decorated up and so forth. And they would get together in the ballroom, upstairs in the ballroom, and auction those off. So the guys would buy that box, and whoever lady had that box, that's who they had dinner with. And then after that, then the band would start playing. The band was made up of Luann's dad and uncle, and Floyd Graham, which is someone I hope you interview. And we've got a photograph in some of our material there of them playing, and they would have a band. Well, then when that band started up, they let the teenagers come in. And so we would be, 16, 15, 16 years old, 17 years old. And of course the girls wanted to dance, and of course the guys did their typical thing, stand over the corner and, make fun of them, and didn't want to get on the dance floor. Afterwards I thought, you dummy, you had all kinds of opportunities here you missed, But... But that was, they had the ballroom there, and that was torn down. But we used to buy our coal there for the furnace. And I remember one year I was going to make a fortune that summer, and that's when the canneries came around and trying to get farmers to plant beans for the cannery. And so I talked my dad in to give me a little chunk, and he gave me a chunk of property. So we planted beans, and then when time to pick, you'd take them up to the co-op, and that was where we would meet with them. And it was disappointing because I spent all summer with a hoe, cleaning, making sure my bean beds were clear of weeds, and pick them, and you take them up there, and they say, well, they're a little bit too dry, they're a little too that, we can't give you that much. I felt I worked all summer for a little bit of money, so...
So where was the co-op located?
Well, that was the part of the co-op. They hired a couple that ran it, and they lived there in the living quarters.
In the hotel?
Yeah.
Okay, is that the one that's across the street from the post office?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay. So canneries would come around and ask you to grow certain things?
Yeah. That particular year that they were trying to get farmers to plant beans.
Do you remember what the name of the company was?
No.
Okay.
Not at all.
Interesting. Huh.
I was pretty young at that time. I probably wasn't more than 10 years old.
Okay. So you said the township was pretty rural. Were there major roads or highways through the township at that time? Well, yeah, you had, Road River Road went through. I remember when Road River Road was still a gravel road. When I lived there, it was real small. And, of course, Belmont Road, Post Road, Samrock were all active roads at the time. Maximowski, of course, was a long driveway to the Maximowski farm, which now have all been built up, but it's now part of the county, township roads. But just all the subdivisions now, roads are all new, obviously. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So when did roads start to become paved? Do you remember that? When?
Well, I remember Road River Road because there was a lane that went from my grandfather's farm down parallel to Belmont Road, because he would use that to get over to the land along Road River Road, but to keep off Belmont Road, the traffic with a team of horses. So he used to go down that lane. And when they were doing the prep work for paving the road, they had closed it off, obviously. Well, my mother, and I'm not sure why we were up there, we were up in Belmont, and she had to get home. And so she took that lane, and I remember seeing those guys were just madder than a hornet because come off this lane in their new gravel that they had just leveled, and she drove back to get home so she'd get the car there before it got locked out. So I was quite young when that happened, so I guess probably 8 or 9 years old or so.
Okay.
But that was when that was paved. But Belmont had been. And both my parents went to school there on the corner of Rogue River and Belmont, which is a Buddhist temple now. But that's where they went to school.
What was the name of that school?
Just Belmont School.
Just Belmont.
Yeah.
That's not where you went to school?
No. No, that was what we refer to as the old school. Ours was right next to the family farm.
Okay, so the place where the Belmont School is now...
Is where I went.
Okay, but does it look the same?
Oh, no. I can't even recognize that little part in the middle where you had the steps to go up in an entryway, then the classroom on either side. And I'm trying, every time I go by there, I try to identify where that little piece is because it's growing north, south, and west from there. It's totally different. In fact, where the fire station is was my grandfather's garden in the field and back where all those elementary classrooms are now. Were part of our, growing the corn and so forth. So, yeah, I can't even recognize it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, how do you feel about these changes that you see in the community now and in the township?
Well, I guess like anything else, good and bad. I miss seeing miss seeing the opportunities that kids had now that I'd had, living in a rural environment where we had the creeks and the ponds and the woods and stuff to play in and do things and using our own imagination, making our own games. They don't have that anymore. It's all grown up and everybody's got organized, and you start playing organized ball when you're 5 years old, And I think that's something that gets lost in that kind of a situation. But that's one of the areas that I think is too bad. I mean, I miss it for somebody else, really. Yeah. So that's probably the biggest single thing I see as a change. The other change I see is that we were a farm community, and everybody was basically politically pretty much the same, And now what I look at, and I'm a little bothered by it, is that a lot of the mentality has not changed from the rural, and when we have a suburban township now rather than a rural one, and I'm not sure that all the thinking has moved and progressed at the same rate. And I think some of the things we're trying to do in the historical committee reflects that too. Mm. Not having the funding that I would like to see to be able to preserve as well as present our heritage, and I don't think there's enough being done along those areas, and I don't think there's enough money that's being appropriated to allow that to happen.
I want to take you back a bit because I don't think we really covered your high school days, and I would like to know at one point, you graduated from Comstock Park High School? Okay, so tell me a little bit. We've talked about how when you went to high school, when you went to that school, you were in the 7th grade.
Right.
And then you were there for probably 4 or 5 years before you graduated?
All the way through, yeah.
Okay, so what was that experience like as you approached, actually, your teenage years? Did they have lots of dances and games and things you were involved with?
Well, first of all, I was an outdoors person. I grew up that way, and I also like sports. And so, fortunately, I was able to compete. So I involved in, track. I went to state one year in a relay. I loved football. Basketball was too short, and And looking back, I think I had a little eyesight problem. And so it was not my favorite sport, but I still participated in it because I had the opportunity. And being a smaller school, larger school, I wouldn't have been able to in that sport. But baseball, I played 4 years in baseball. Track was 4 years. And so that kept me busy. Now the drawback to that was I had bus transportation in the morning, but at night when you're involved in these activities, you're on your own. You know, it's exactly 4 miles from my door of my house to the door of the school. And many times I walked it going home. And we tried to hitchhike in those days. You could hitchhike. It's only a 2-lane highway, and half the people past you knew you, you know. And so a lot of times they get rides for part of the way, but that was one of the negatives. But that being a smaller high school than, you know, compared to the Grand Rapids schools, gave me those opportunities. So I was able to participate in that. But we had a lot of school activities. I was involved in the plays, both the junior and senior play. We had those, and of course we had in the fall, homecoming and that kind of thing. So I was involved in all those activities.
So what was your first date?
First date?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was pretty shy when it came to the ladies, younger, so it wasn't. I would probably in the 10th grade was my first date.
What did you do?
I can't tell secrets.
Sure you can.
No, just kidding. First of all, at that age, you didn't have a car. Your parents had to pick you up and drop you off, type of thing. So you had to behave yourself. And of course, all of us were lectured pretty heavily with that anyway. But yeah, in fact, I had the same girlfriend very much through high school.
You did?
And so involved in all the activities of plays and homecoming and dances and that kind of thing.
So can you share her name?
So her name was Phyllis. She's passed away.
So what would a dance be like when you were able to drive? Did you get dressed up? What did you do?
Yeah, we did. In fact, I remember getting my first suit because of some school function. My mother took me down. I don't remember what store now, and we got what they call a student suit. And that was my first suit. See, I grew up also with a lot of hand-me-downs. My dad had a fellow he worked with who had a son just a year or two older than me. So he passed on a lot of clothes, and they were good clothes. I mean, they were right. But one thing he did give me, which tore me up, knickers. I don't know if you know what knickers were. Okay. So one day,
describe them.
One day I decided to wear them to school, and I'd stand in line for the bus to pick me up, pick us up, and you should have heard the whooping and hollering. And I had a miserable day at school wearing those knickers because some of them had never seen them before, but you know it came just down below your knees, and you had long socks with them. I never wore them again. That was the end of that.
Okay. Let's see. Any other favorite memories as a teenager? Things you used to do that were really fun?
Well, there's a lot of memories. Like, for example, when you got your first letter in sports, you belonged to the varsity club, and they had an initiation which would not be allowed nowadays, I'm sure. They kind of gave us a hard time.
What did they do?
Well, first of all, you had to make your own paddle, which is about big. And it was not unheard of for one of the senior people would take you over to one of the teachers and give her the paddle to paddle my butt. And they did. Like I said, you wouldn't do that nowadays, but then they would concoct all kinds of things to make you uncomfortable. And then sometime during the night take you out in the countryside and dump you off in the corner and let you find your way back. But that was part of the varsity initiation. that they had.
What about drinking and those kinds of things? Were there, you know, like when I was growing up, we called them grassers, and kids would be out.
Not really. There always had some kids at school that were smokers or that drank. In fact, one of the guys in my class was a little bit older, and excellent athlete, but he couldn't play couldn't play spring sports in his last year because he was too old, and he was emotionally well advanced to the rest of us, and he would be the one to be drinking, for example, and smoking. But for the most part, not. The biggest, the only time I can think of any time in high school where the guys would get together, I got in trouble because of it, but it was not all that bad. But we got our hands on some hard cider, and we were down, I shouldn't even tell this story. We were down to a friend's house whose parents were out of town, and a bunch of us guys get down there. We're playing cards, but no booze or anything. And one of the guys wanted to go down to get in the landlord's drugstore to get something, aspirin or something, and I took him down. And when he came back in the car, I started back to Don's house, and here was a carload of girls in our class, including my girlfriend. So I started racing down West River Road. Unfortunately, there was a deputy sheriff there, and he stopped me. And first thing he was checking was whether we'd been drinking, and obviously I had not, so it was not a problem. But what was the problem was that down in the back seat of the car was a grocery bag with empty beer bottles in it. And in the trunk of the car was a bushel of apple pulp. Now, if you could smell apple pulp, it's very similar to smelling booze. And he said, it smells like a brewery in here out of the car. And of course, I'm scared to death at this point. Where's the party? There's no party. You're lying to me. Where is the party? There's no party. So he realized I had not been drinking. I explained what the apple pulp was for. My dad had gotten it because he was raising worms for fishing. Okay. So anyway, I didn't dare go back to the party, but I didn't dare go home because I knew if I got home I'm going to be dead. So finally, eventually, I went back to the party and told the guys, I said, I got to get home. I was scared. I was scared to death. So, of course, I get in, and we're talking well after midnight by this point, and I knock on the dad's bedroom door. My father was not an easy guy to wake up, and he'd come out swinging sometimes. Dad, I got a problem. So he gets out of the bed, and what's going on? I told him, and he started laughing. And I thought, what's going on here? Well, when I told him who the deputy was, he laughed. He said, oh, I know him. He and I went to California together once. And so I got on that, but that was that's about as close as I can think of where we got involved in any booze or anything in high school.
Did you get a ticket?
Most of the guys I ran with were athletes. We were involved in athletics, and that was important to us.
Did you get a ticket or something? Is that why you were concerned?
I got a chewing out and just told not to go back to the party. I hadn't done anything wrong. Well, I did because I forgot to turn the headlights on when I was racing. But
yeah, that could be a problem.
But
okay. So tell me a little bit about the world of work. So you were working even as a child, but how did you think about work? And when did that change when you actually got a job?
Well, the first job I had was working in a hardware store.
And when was that?
I was still in high school. My dad had a friend who was an engineer for a company that he was working for at the time, and John and his brother-in-law bought a hardware store, and so I think it was in the summer between my junior and senior year that I started as summer help in the hardware store. Made 75 cents an hour, and that was my first paid job. Now, I did a lot of work for farmers around. For example, during corn harvesting time, I would work for Dan Booth, hauling corn in, type of thing. But for, a structured job with the hardware store. And I worked for them on Saturdays during the school year. And then when I was going to JC, I worked for them in afternoons and Saturdays. And that was the first paying job that I had. But I learned a lot working in that hardware store, which was very handy. I mean, you learn a lot on the farm, too. But this was a different adventure, and so I think oftentimes many things that I've done as a result of learning what on the job as a salesperson, a clerk at a hardware store.
Can you give me an example? An example of?
Well, like plumbing. Plumbing, for example. There was a master plumber that worked out of the hardware store there. And so I learned, things from him when he's getting supplies, and he explained stuff to me. And so, yeah, what's available, the tools that's used, and how they're used was very, very helpful. It'd be helpful for anyone that owned a home and want to maintain it themselves. Mm-hmm. So that was a good experience, real good experience.
So let's talk about what happened after you graduated from high school. What were your plans? What did you do?
Well, originally my plans were to join the Marine Corps. My buddy and I were going to join right out of school. And I have to say, I was a good student. I was an honor student, but I got tired of school, and probably a senior year, if it wasn't for the fact you were a senior and you had a little more relaxed rules and involved in athletics, I probably would have been an unhappy camper. But so I wasn't ready to go on, but unfortunately, Korean War was still going on. And so I didn't apply for any scholarships. Of course, my folks were not able to afford, in any college tuition or anything. So at the last minute, I decided to go to JC, and I and like I said, I had to work in the hardware store to pay for my, car. I had an old Ford, and be able to, pay for the gas and take care of that, and pay for, tuition, that kind of thing. Of course, that time growing up as junior college, now community college, was a lot less expensive than going to a four-year college. So I went to JC for 2 years. And I went to work for a company that my dad was working for, but a different plant. And but in the meantime, and when I was at JC, I joined two programs. One was called the PLC program, the Marine Corps Platoon Leaders class. And then I also joined the reserves, Marine Corps Reserves. Simple reason was extra money. And the other is that as long as I was going to go through the program of getting a commission, getting the active reserves, of course, would be really helpful. And when at the end of, towards the end of the second year, I dropped a class. And I was struggling because, first of all, going back to our education in Comstock Park, we were way behind the city schools when it came to lab work, for example. And I was taking all engineering courses. And so I was taking physics and chemistry at the same time. I hated chemistry to begin with. But I didn't know, we'd go into a lab for an assignment, and these kids would start doing their assignment, and I didn't even know how to use the equipment. So we were really deficient in that area, and that was very handicapped. That made it difficult. But anyway, I dropped this chemistry class, but not unknowing that I dropped 1 credit below what I needed to stay in the PLC program. I had gone to Quantico for my basic training that first summer, and so I had gone through that, and then all of a sudden, you missed it. Nothing I can do about it. But I stayed in the reserves. And so that put me eligible then for the draft. We still had the draft at that time. So I had worked enough to save me for another year of college. And I went to the draft board and say, when is my number going to be coming up? Here's my plans. She said, well, if you get enrolled in September, she said, you're safe. I didn't believe her. And so when I went to summer camp in August of that year, 56, I told my dad, I said, anything comes from the draft board, don't open it, don't touch it, just hide it and call me. And about 2 days before we're leaving to come back to Michigan, I get a call from my dad, guess what's here? So I was the first sergeant. I said, you better start cutting me new orders. I got to stay down here. He said, I can't do that. So anyway, we went back home. Then right after Labor Day, as I was train back to Camp Lejeune. So that took care of that little problem. Well, in the meantime, while I was in, Jean and I got married, and had our firstborn was born in the Naval Hospital at Camp Lejeune. You see these advertisements on the TV all the time about the toxic at Camp Lejeune, all these law firms are thing. We lived there at that during that period of time too. So anyway, I went down, and I was very fortunate because of a background that I had the E4 at the time, and they kept me there training recruits, which was tough duty from a standpoint of hours you put in because you're with recruits round the clock. But it was a good lesson in leadership too, because every 30 days I get 42 kids at 17, 18, 19 years old who thought they were Marines and they weren't quite there yet, and we were still polishing them off. And so it got to the point that I get a new group in and I could put a name to every single one of those 42 guys because I've had them before, you know. You can pick out the troublemakers just, you know, like that. So when that tour was up, then we moved back to Michigan. I probably would, if I had been single, I may have made a career out of it. But they were cutting back in the Marine Corps at the time, because after the Korean War and before the Vietnam War. And so, but there was also a recession going on, but I had a job because that time people had to hire you back if you when you got out of the service. So that's where I started my engineering career with that company then.
Okay, so let's hold on that thought. How did you meet Barbara?
Jean was her name.
Jean. Okay, I'm sorry.
Well, at first, I met her on a blind date first when I was a freshman at JC and she was a senior in high school. But then we just had the one date. But then when she started JC, she went to JC for 2 years and then Albion College. But when she started the freshman, I was a sophomore, and we started dating, and that's how I met her. So mostly while we're at JC.
So you were on a blind date with her originally?
Yeah.
What did you do? Where did you go? Do you remember?
Well, we went with another couple that set us up. The guy that I went to school with was dating the gal that she went to high school with, different schools. And we went out and had dinner together. And
what did you think? Were you like struck right up at love at first sight, or?
Well, I wouldn't say it was love at first sight. She had a totally different background than mine, and I had not, you know, you had to get to know somebody pretty well before that. And I mentioned to you on the phone when we were talking the other day about her background. She was an English major, and majored in also library science, and we talk about, you know, wordsmithing and that kind of thing. And so, and I was just a plowboy from the country, you know, at the Coast Talk Park, but. Wasn't any sparks at that time. But once we got to know her when we were at school, we'd see each other at school quite a bit. But at that time, enrollment at JC was not near what it is now. Matter of fact, when I got out of the service, I went to school night school for about 5 years, and I took some class at JC, and I found the enrollment at night was more than it was during the day when I was going full time. That's much how I was growing, and so it was just one of those kind of things we just got acquainted and just sort of fit, and it makes some both of us making adjustments in our lifestyle and how we did. Her parents were both educators, and Dad was a superintendent and Mother was a teacher, and so, you know, we had adjustments as they went through. So just.
Well, that sounds very intriguing. So, when you first met, did you feel like you were just a farm boy? That were you intimidated, or were you?
Well, I wasn't intimidated. I just was not socially advanced as she was. She's more, more cosmopolitan than I was because coming from the city, and she didn't quite understand the farm mentality either. There were certain things that I would do she'd frown on because we did that in the farm, what's the earth make?
Give me an example. That sounds very intriguing.
It's, well, I'm not sure I can give you a good example. It's just a lot of little things that when you're with somebody, that, as you're getting acquainted, you pick up these little mannerisms or social etiquette that maybe that wasn't as well advanced as she was, we'll put it that way.
Okay. Were her parents okay with you?
No, they weren't initially. One reason why is at that time I smoked. I started smoking after I got out of high school, which was stupid, but at that time everybody was doing it, and that was one of the things I smoked. And there was also some background there that I was not aware of at the time, that because her dad applied for a job as the superintendent of Comstock Park, and my uncle was on the board at the time, and he didn't get the job, and there was a little bit there, but no, not. That was reconciled down the road, though. After we were married and got settled down, that went away. It was not a problem, but initially it was.
So can you tell me how you proposed?
Mostly long distance because it was, I was in the Marine Corps, and she was still in school here, and I guess it was just two of those things that writing back and forth, we just agreed that would be what we wanted to do.
So you didn't get down on one knee or anything like that?
Well, that was a long ways down to North Carolina from here.
Okay. Now, you had a picture that was kind of interesting to me where you're on the beach. I think it was when you were in the service. You were in a swimsuit, and I don't have the picture with me. I just have this kind of...
Oh, I think that's one where I'm leaning against something.
Yes, yes.
That was a landing craft. That was a military landing craft that was standing next to.
So Lejeune was right by the ocean?
Oh, very close to the ocean. See, Camp Lejeune was basically in a swamp. In fact, buddy Joe, I mentioned, his older brother was an officer in the Army, and I was talking to him one day, and he said he had gone to Camp Lejeune for swamp training at Camp Lejeune. We were not very far from the ocean. In fact, we spent a lot of time down there. We used to take air mattresses and take them out to the breakers, hop on, and then let the breakers throw us in. But there was a whole stretch of area there that had been wiped out by a hurricane years previous to that. And there was a good road going down, but to drive, you'd see the cement and tar entrance to garages, but the buildings were all gone. So we pulled up in one of those and go down to the beach and not have anybody within a couple hundred yards of us. So we used to go down there a lot. And that was probably one. If it was a military craft, then it would have had to been part of not a family type thing, but exercise in the Marine Corps.
Right. And you were also certified as a marksman, correct?
I was expert rifleman, yeah.
Was that something that came naturally to you, or did?
Well, yeah, because I grew up. I grew up with guns, and I hunted very early age. My dad would take me. I had a musket that a friend of my dad's, he was part Indian, he had given me when I was a little kid. And I would take that and carry that with my dad, and I'd follow him around, and he taught me the proper gun handling and how to go through fences and this kind of thing. And so I had an early background, but then during the years of when I was a teenager growing up, I mean, we were out in the woods with 22s or in the swamps all the time with the guns. And so I was, naturally I was a good shot, but in the Marine Corps, of course, it was a little different kind of shooting. But I shot a possible 500 yards, which is a long ways, But yeah, I was expert for a rifle and also a pistol.
That's very cool. Okay, let's see here. So how many children do you have?
2.
2. Tell me a little bit about that. What was it like? Did you want to have children, and were you excited?
Oh yeah, Linnea was born in the Naval Hospital down there, and that was a whole different program because they couldn't. I take her to the door and you get out of here. We don't need you, type of thing. And I was out on a field problem with the recruits at the time, and so I was in close contact with the field phones. And so when I found out I'm the father. So I went to my commanding officer, I said, I need to get the main side. And so, like I said, we were out in the boondocks, and so I picked up a bus ride into Geiger and got into the hospital. And but yeah, that was when she was born. That was a different story. When Tom was born after we got out. And we were out at my folks' house out in the country, and she wasn't feeling too good, and we decided to stay there rather than driving home because we were living in Comstock Park at the time, only 5 miles or 4 miles away, but just stay right here. Well, her water broke. So I got her in a car, and I'm driving down Plainfield Avenue. Of course, it's nothing like it is now. Breaking every speed law, we're hoping a cop would come around. I never saw one. And we're getting to St. Mary's. It's where a doctor worked out of. And I pulled into the wrong entrance. I had dated a gal, I was a nurse there, and I didn't realize they changed the emergency exit wrong side. So by the time I got her around, got her unloaded, they took her in, I went and parked, came back in, and I walked in and said, here's your son. It was just that quick. It was really close. Wow. But yeah, that was where Tom was born.
Oh. Wow, that must have been a moment. Very nice. Okay, so do you want to take a break? I know we've been going at this for probably an hour or so. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I could use some drink of water.
I would be happy to get you some. Hang on. Do you like ice in it?
No, it doesn't matter if you got a dandy.
All right, let me just pause this for the moment here.
Had a chair like that. I had, that was, after I retired, I set up a business of doing refurbishing antiques. And I was at a garage sale, and this guy had a desk back in the corner. And it looked pretty good when I see it. I was interested in it, and I kind of, I don't know. He wanted $50 for it. He said, I'll throw in the chair. And the chair was painted brown, crappy looking. And I said, oh, okay. So I took, well, it turned out to guess I ended up using this workbench because it was those old-fashioned typewriter types which you pull the thing out and it comes up. It worked better as a bench. But when I stripped it, oak, gorgeous oak, and I didn't have any use for it. I gave it to my sister. She just, when she moved from New Jersey, and she set up there, and I said, you're welcome, you can have it. It's I changed the caster so it'd be easier to work on the carpeting, but the chair, so it turned out to be a gorgeous oak.
Yeah. This was a little squeaky. That's why I got this other chair to sit in, because it makes too much noise. Okay, so let's go back to your parenting. How did you and Jean decide the rules for your children, and what was your style of being a dad? How would you compare it to your dad?
One of the things that's been very apparent very quickly is that I took care of anything involving injuries where blood was involved. I took care of those problems, okay? Anything with internal distresses, she took care of. And one of the things I hate, of course, back in those days we had used diapers, and I just had a terrible time. I was babysitting and have to clean the diapers. I struggled with that every time. And 2 kids, I would still struggle with it, but that was 2 of the things. Very quickly we established who was going to do what. You know. Came to blood, I take care of it. Didn't bother me any, but that hurt.
So what about punishment? What do you think about that?
We very early on, we agreed that whatever decision one of us made, the other would support. And usually we talked about it ahead of time. If we had an incident that was developing, she was probably more lenient than I was. I was probably a little more rigid because I grew up in a rigid environment. We kept our mouth shut when we were told to keep our mouth shut. So we would talk sometimes. We see if something developing, how are we going to handle this? And we'd get together. And whatever decision we made, we both stuck with it. There was never any question at all that don't go to Daddy if you're going to get another step. It isn't going to do you a bit of good, you know.
So what about as your kids got older? Did you see new challenges in raising children, like completely different from your own experience?
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, the environment we were living in when raising the kids were totally different than I grew up. Like I said, I grew up with the whole world as my playground, and with not much supervision. I mean, I was a responsible individual, so I was given a long leash. When my kids were growing up, mostly their formative years was we were living in Charlotte at the time, small town, and you can, mile from one side of town to the other. It was a different environment for the kids too. They didn't have the opportunities that I had of having the freedom, being able to do things because we're now more of a city environment. And so, yeah, it was different. Also, they were exposed to more of the things that I wasn't, that you don't want your kids to be exposed to. And so we had, she and I both had to adjust to that type of thing.
What were some of those things?
Well, they were going in the 60s, for example, with the hippies and time. My daughter turned into going to be a hippie. You know, my son was totally different. So that was something we had to deal with that neither one of us had a background for. I mean, nope, I don't think any parent did. But that was just what the kids were going through. And I do remember one time there was so much talk about, this generation gap. And I remember this lady, she was comes from a family that one of the founders of the town, who ancestors go way back, and this was in church. She got up and she says, there has always been a generation gap. And I agree with that, she was, because we all, within a generation of 20 years or 22 years, things changed, and it's changing much more rapidly than they used to. So, yeah, we went in the 60s, we were in Charlotte, and things were a lot different than when I grew up. And so we had to, Gene and I had to compensate for that with our own thinking.
So let's go to your employment. Now, when we left your educational saga, you were just about to take your first job in engineering.
Yes.
And you were married then?
Yes.
And did you have children then?
Yep.
Oh, you had 2 or 1?
I had 2.
Okay. So let's start there.
Tom was born after I went to work for him. But I went back to the same company I had worked with in the plant in engineering. And basically what I was doing...
And what was the name of that company? What was the company name?
C.O. Porter Machinery Company. It no longer exists.
Okay.
They had a plant down on Front Street where my dad worked, and I was at a welding shop up off Plymouth. But when I was in the service, they added to it and they moved all the operations out there. And that's where, when I got out, went into engineering and basically was designing the equipment. And what they did is they built machinery for the woodworking industry. And what I mostly focused on was the conveyors part of it. And while I was working there, they were building a lot of components that I felt could be more beneficial if they were outsourced. And so I contacted Rapistan, which was across the street. And they sent a salesman over, and I told him what I was looking for, like components on end drives and so forth. And got to know them, and so I started, rather than designing a particular piece of equipment, rather than designing end assemblies from scratch, I would buy them from Rapistan. So that's how I got acquainted with Rapistan. Well, one day when Harry was over, and I said there was an ad in the paper for an engineer. And he said, I think that's our office. And he worked for the field office, which is Rapistan in Michigan. And he called me a few minutes later, you got an appointment tomorrow. So I went over and interviewed, and then went to work for them. And my engineering then changed from strictly designing to concepting systems rather than the details. Now, when I was with Porter, still with Porter's, I also did a lot of road trips of supervising the installation of this equipment, and then get into some of these small towns in the hills of West Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee. It was an interesting experience. I had some real interesting experiences with those folks, and a different culture entirely. And so with Rapistan then, I went from doing that to, they approached me, probably maybe 3 years been in engineering, and they were having problems in one of the markets over the eastern part of the state, Jackson, Lansing, Ann Arbor, that area. And they thought, well, maybe if an engineer goes out, because most of the time when we dealt with customers was with engineering rather than purchasing, that maybe the engineer gets out with them, we'd expand the market. So they asked me if I wanted to take a crack at it. I said, why not? That's something new. And that's how I ended up in sales, but that was not part of my plan to ever end up in sales, because I still had to, in my mind, focus when I think of salesmen, BSR individuals and so forth. So anyway, so I did, and I enjoyed it. I loved the freedom. That was really the thing I really liked. Just I couldn't imagine, after I was in sales a couple of years, ever going back to a drawing board, sitting in an office all day. But so I did that, and that's when I got involved in Charlotte. Actually, we didn't intend to move to Charlotte. I was going to move to Lansing, but we were having difficulty finding a house, and through somebody else, said there was a house for rent in Charlotte. Once we got there, we were there a year, and we decided we liked Charlotte, so we bought a house, and that's why I was there for 10 years, and that's how I got involved in the educational system and so forth. And so anyway, then I had an opportunity to come back to Grand Rapids as a sales supervisor and operations manager it was sort of a training program for the customer center managers. And so I did that and for about a year, and then I went down to Indianapolis and managed that office for about 5 years.
And what company was that?
Rapistan.
Oh, still all with Rapistan.
Still part of the Rapistan organization. And then I was about 5 years there, then I was approached by Vice President of Field Operations that they were having problems out in California in the LA office. And I would like to go out there and try to penetrate that market and see if we should have an office. And so Gene and I talked about it, and we were, no kids, nothing. That'd be quite an adventure, do that, something in a different part of the country. So we agreed to do it. Was the idea of being there from 18 to 24 months. But if it didn't work out, and I, decided we'd close that office, to be placed someplace in the south. Mm. And so I thought, okay. So, but unfortunately, because for tax purposes, I didn't want to sell the house in Indiana, so I leased it out. And the day I signed the lease, I was told that they were going to close that office before I ever got there. So I spent the next year then going through closing the office and combining it with San Francisco. And at the same time, a manager, regional manager of the Southern Region, offered me a job as manager in Texas. So I said, okay, so for about several months, 2 weeks in Texas, 2 weeks in California, and 2 weeks back and forth, until we got that all closed down. Then I spent the next 5 years about 6 years in Texas.
What part of Texas?
We lived in Arlington, between Dallas and Fort Worth.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't a very nice experience. Also, difference in culture between 30 miles between the two towns, and cosmopolitan Dallas and cowboy Fort Worth thing. And so a lot of fun places to go in both areas. So we enjoyed that, but that's when she passed away with lung cancer.
Oh.
And so that ended all our plans at that point. But
was she sick for a long time?
No, in fact, it started in the spring, and she had always had problems with respiratory problems, and from time to time pneumonia and so forth. And she had asthma as a child, and she was not feeling well in late spring. And we came up to Michigan on vacation, and we spent a week with my daughter, who was living here. She was married, and then we had to spend a week up at the cottage with some friends from Charlotte. And when we were up there, she couldn't really do much of anything. She had terrible, but she went to a doctor here. Well, I flew back to Texas after 2 weeks, and she stayed one more week. And the doctor says, well, I can't do anything for you. Just talk to your people when you get back. Mm. So I made an appointment for her, and when she came back, she stayed, the extra week here. And we got to the doctor, and they were down in the hospital running tests, and I got a call, and it was in the morning. I had just gone into the office, and they called and said the doctor wants to meet in your wife's room this morning. So when I got there, our family doctor and another doctor came in. That's when we were informed that she had terminal cancer, and it was really a shock.
Oh my God, yes.
That changed a lot of our plans, but we had a lot of good years together. The years we were in India and Charlotte, we were away from any family environments, and we're totally different. It's one of the things that happens, especially in the farm community, is you must be Ray's son. You're somebody's son or somebody's daughter. Where when we went to move from here to there, we were totally independent. Nobody knew us. We were non-native, okay? Yeah. Which was also kind of interesting because I was involved in the school because my kids were both in school there, but I've probably spent one whole year going to board meetings, just listening. And because I got to know some of the people there, curriculum director and some of the others, because they always question, why is that guy coming for all our meetings, And I didn't have any ulterior motives at the time. And all. So anyway, about a year of that, then somebody said, why don't you run? And I thought, I was the first non-native to be elected to the school board, okay? And so I was on it for 2 years, and the board was split. 2 guys from the city and 2 guys from the rural, and they were a long ways apart. And I was a compromise between the 2 groups. They both accepted me as a president, so I had to be a president of the board for 2 years, and I ran again, and then was reelected and also elected as president. But then I resigned when I moved to Indiana. So, but that was a great experience too. Though I got involved, you found out when the small town mentality, when you're president of the school board, people approach you differently than you would under other circumstances, Mm. And so.
What do you mean by that? What was the difference in how people approached you?
Well, if I go to the bank and want to get a loan, I would get pretty good interest rates.
Really?
You know, things like that happen. You get to know people that you wouldn't otherwise know, and you know, and you also get on the list for every volunteer position that's available. You know, we would serve on this committee, we would serve on that committee, and so forth. And so that got to the point that I was spending way too much time on school. I was spending probably 20 hours a week on just the school business.
Oh my gosh.
But I had a flexible schedule being in sales, you know, and I could do that. Somebody that worked in a restricted office, certain hours, but not been able to do that. But you know, it was a great experience. We went through a teacher strike. We went through the budget cuts. We had, in fact, I think I may have given you one of the articles there about how we handled it when we were very physically threatened in the meetings and so forth. And I had some very kind words, I thought, from the superintendent based on how that was handled. But and we got one strike so that was not according to the rules, and but I had credibility with a lot of people, and as well as the teachers, and you know, like when negotiations came, we just wasn't making any progress at all, and the attorney just whispered in my ear. He said they're going to do an end run. They're going to contact you, and about 2 weeks later they did, and asked me to meet with them. And I said, not alone. I said, if I can bring another board member, I'll be glad to talk to you. So we sat down and we worked out a compromise. And I went to the attorney and I said, here you got to be in Lansing at this place at 6 o'clock on what day? I said, you got a contract. And nobody knew what we had done, and including the superintendent. So it was kind of a shock when it came about, but we got it settled. But I had credibility with a lot of those people because they knew that I'm not playing games. We don't have, you know, hidden books that they keep. That's a big thing that always came up. Well, you got 2 sets of books, you know. Yeah, right. So that was kind of neat. So that was my experience in the volunteer community efforts, and then I was also master of the lodge while I was there too. So that 1 year, in fact, it was the year my daughter graduated from high school, I was gone pretty much every evening with those activities. So in a way, it was a kind of relief when I got to Indiana. We're starting all over again with a different environment, all new people. We moved into a brand new development on the reservoir, and got into playing racquetball and, you know, that type of thing. So it was the experiences I've had, you know, between that and California, which was a whole different ball game, and Texas, which is 2 different cultures that you can get involved with if you wish. I got into country western dancing, of course, and that was a good experience also. So.
Well, you've had quite a life filled with experience. When you look back, do you see something that has really stuck with you as maybe your most important lessons in life or your most important contribution in your life?
Well, from lessons, I'm not sure it was not lessons, because I guess I basically was a person with had empathy. I hated bullies, for example, and I just had a real hard time with that. But I think integrity and honesty is probably a major thing with somebody that I see so much of that now, so much of dishonesty. That being fair and honest, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a great attribute to anybody to have. And the fairness factor was always strong with me as a kid. And I think you carried that through. You get a little hardened a little bit as you get older when you get into real life. But still, you can't lose that. You've got to be able to maintain that and exercise it properly. And that, I think that's the biggest change that I've seen in all my 80-some years is the difference between growing up in that kind of environment as to what I see growing up in this environment. I've got a great grandson, and I've got one, and I'm watching him very carefully, and watching my grandson raise him, because I was raised with so much was based on fairness. You got to be fair to your brother. You got to be good to your brother and sister, type of thing, as well as anybody else. And so many times when I was younger, I would take a punishment or abuse when I didn't deserve it, because I didn't want to get somebody else in trouble. And I thought there was nothing wrong with that, you know. So that to me, that is a very high priority in my mind, that I want to see in all my kids, grandkids, and great-great-grandkids.
Wonderful. Okay, so what are the historical events that you lived through that affected you most?
Well, probably World War II, because at a very young age we were just, you know, overloaded with radio and printed matter of the war. And so you were playing soldier a lot in your own mind and with your toys. And that was probably the biggest thing, because it's a major event in the country, our country's history. And so that was probably the biggest influence of anything.
What do you think is the most significant technological change?
Probably anything to do with internet and computers, because at my age I struggle with it.
I do. Okay. Let me ask you to go back. What was your dream for your future when you were a child? And how do you think it turned out?
Probably, as a child, would have been a military lifestyle. Mm-hmm. That probably would have been, being again in that environment at that time, being 7, 8 years old when the war started. You're rah, you're going to help, and so probably military. And I know growing up I was going to be in the Marine Corps. And I had an uncle who was in the Marine Corps, and I had, it's kind of vague in my mind, but he lived west of us someplace, because he'd come down over the hills, and he'd come to the house. He was sort of almost a lost child, but broken home or what. His name was Harold Thornton. And he joined the Marine Corps when the war broke out, and he was wounded in the Battle of Tulagi. And I got a picture in my album at home that he comes out to visit, because he adopted my mother as a mother, I think. And he came to visit, and I think that probably solidified what I wanted to do. And that's what I had earlier. The plan was that Don and I were going to join the Marine Corps. We got out of high school, but he went in, and I went on to school, which was a smarter thing to do, but that was a goal at that time,
Okay. And what have you enjoyed most about your life?
What I enjoyed most, probably my marriage to Jean. So many things that we did, especially with our moving in different cultures, was like when we lived in Diamond Bar, which was outside of L.A. up in the foothills. So we were watch the smog go by below us. But she was a gourmet cook to begin with, and so any ethnic food you want in the L.A. basin, you can find it very closely. So we were living in the hotel first before we finally leased the house, but what we have for supper nights, we get yellow pages out, and how about Japanese? So we'll pick out 2 or 3 restaurants and then drive by and see what they've got of cars in front and so forth. And the first one we went to was walked in, nobody spoke English. And that was an experience. And we served soup with, where's our spoon? We look around, everybody was drinking their soup with a cup, So We had one of the guys that worked for me out there was from India, and of course Indians and a lot of other ethnic groups, anybody is their cousin, whether they are not. Well, his cousin owned this Indian restaurant, and there were, I think, 4 couples of us went there, and he said, I'll order for you. And he ordered several different kinds of dishes, and we just passed them around and sampled different parts. And then he took us back in the kitchen and showed us how they were cooking the bread. And in the middle of the floor, there's this brick oven down in the floor. And this guy's got this raw dough, and he reaches down, he slaps it, and puts it on the tub there. And I said, wow, how'd you keep from burning your arm? He pulled the sleeve up, he's all scarred up where he'd been burnt. And then they, little hook, they pull it out when they get done. But the point being is that there were so many different kinds of restaurants there that we just had, from a coastal standpoint, it was a fantastic experience. And we tried most everything, but you wouldn't find in Grand Rapids or any northern town. But
That's wonderful. Any advice that you would give for future generations?
well, that might take a while. No, I guess I say that, could sum it up and say, be active in your community and be honest. You know, deal with people fairly. You know, you don't have to win every game. You can come in second without being hurt, but play the game fairly, and do what you can do, and don't try to do too much. Don't try to take on more responsibilities or tasks than you're capable of handling. Stay within that range. So that would be probably in a very general way, but
That sounds great. Very perfect.
Would be my advice, I guess.
Yeah. I think my husband just came in. Hi, husband.
Walk very quietly.
Yeah.
I heard the steps creak.
Well, that's just wonderful. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you came to think of and would like to share?
Well, we covered a lot of things and kind of jumped around in some instances, one thing to another. But you know, overall, I think I'm very fortunate. You know, I'm ill once and all, but I'm 88 years old, approaching 89 very quickly. And the other day, I was trying to find out why this dizziness was taking place, and this young guy came in, and he's only in the office for 30 days, so I suspect he might be a resident. And he's questioning me, he answered all kinds of questions, and obviously a medical person. And I mentioned something, I said about playing golf. He said, "Are you still playing golf?" I said, "Well, why not?" You know. So I guess I have to consider myself very fortunate, because most of my schoolmates are gone, and I've lost both my sister and my brother, and so I'm still kicking, and maybe not as high, as fast, but still going on. So I consider myself fortunate. I also consider myself fortunate of the experiences I've had, because it has been a lot from different parts of the country and from different aspects. And so, you know, going into sales, which is something I never planned, but it worked out for me. It was a lot more, financially, it was a lot better off than being in engineering. I also had a lot more freedom I had in engineering. So those things happened by happenstance, not by any long-range plan. And so it worked out. It was disappointing when I went out to California under this particular program, but it was cut short before I had a chance to even attempt it. And I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do now? You know, well then Texas came along, and that worked out also too. So the only, of course, disappointment is when I lost my wife. It was, like I said, all the plans that we had, now that we had no children at the home, we just went down the tube. But you play the hand that's dealt you, you know, what you do.